to this shared webinar between Climate-Eval Community of Practice and Sea Change Community of Practice. The title of the webinar is Learning from Evaluations of Climate Change and Development Interventions, and how does this inform policy? What we will see in a moment is that this was one of 4 streams that took place here at IDS in Sussex at the event called Acting on What We Know and How We Learn for Climate and Development Policy. My name is Dennis Boers, I'm the Sea Change team leader, and to my right hand side it's Andrew Zubiri, the team leader of the Climate-Eval Community of Practice. Andrew, would you want to say a few words on the Q&A session that we will have in 30 minutes, just to explain the technical side?
Sure. Towards the end, we will have a Q&A portion after all the presentations have been given. And we'll collect 3 questions each at a time, and then we will ask the presenters to address these questions.
Thank you. At this table, we currently have 5 people, and I'll introduce them to you. Lars Otto-Naas is from IDS Sussex. He's the climate change team leader, and he will start with an introduction background on the climate change learning event that we have had here over the past 2 days. Then we have Mr. Rob Vandenberg, who just falls out of the screen I see in this little view. But he's here, he's the director of the Global Environment Facility Evaluation Office. And he will be talking about linking climate change learning and climate change evaluations. After that, I will talk for 5 minutes to link evaluation evidence with policy development. And after that, it will be Duncan Ashworth of IDS Knowledge Services Systems, who will talk about climate change knowledge management and brokerage. And he will take an international perspective. And last but not least, we have Charles Tunui. Do I say that right? Yes. From ACTS, who is an environmental scientist and climate change specialist, and he will talk about climate change knowledge brokering from a national and local community perspective. So for the moment, I would like to give the word to Lars Otto-Naas to give an introduction on what has happened here over the past 2 days.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and hello everybody. This is a new experience to me of being part of a webinar, so it's very exciting. As Dennis said, we've just finished a 2-day knowledge sharing event led by the IDS Climate Change team, but partnering with the GF Evaluation Office, DFID, the Climate Change and Development Knowledge Network, and the CGIAR's Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Program. And the topic of the sharing event was to explore how learning is or isn't taking place in climate and development policy spaces, and whether the knowledge we are generating is acted upon. And it grew out of a shared kind of emerging sense that we are not learning enough, or we are not learning in the right way, and that traditional ways of approaching climate change as a very complex problem is not sufficient anymore, and we need to find new ways of doing so. So the event was organized around 4 key themes. I'll just briefly go through them. Won't be able to go into a lot of detail, but the 4 themes were first around whose knowledge counts, focusing particularly on locally held knowledge. The second one was around brokers, translators, and intermediaries. The third one was around evaluations and how we learn from those in and between organizations. And the fourth one was around extreme events and disaster risk reduction. And these are 4 sort of distinct both theoretical areas but also communities of practice. And I thought there were 3 things that stood out to me. First of all, there were a lot of similar challenges across these. Even though there are distinct areas, there were a lot of the challenges that came up were quite similar. Secondly, I think we need to find better ways of creating incentives for learning. We need to not more, but just learn better, as Andy Newsham, my colleague, summarized yesterday, and I think that describes it very well. And the third one, which I think was very interesting, and to me one of the most rewarding parts of the event, was to have sessions where we got together with evaluation and knowledge brokering and across the 4 themes. So there were a lot of spaces or discussion time and spaces for discussion between the 4 themes, which I thought was probably the most rewarding part of the event. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to go into more details on the themes as we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Rob, would you like to take 5 minutes to discuss how climate change learning and climate change evaluations are linked?
Thank you. Yes, it was very interesting sessions that we had. We discussed learning from the theory of learning perspective on one-loop learning, where you really look at what happened. Two-loop learning, where we ask the question, should we have done it in a different way? Or three-loop learning, where we actually say, was this the right activity to do? And should we have done something else? And we identified very quickly that a theory-based approach is an appropriate way for evaluators to raise these questions, to be able to incorporate these questions in evaluations. And especially a theory of change approach, where you go through the assumptions that are supposed to make the intervention work. And you identify them, and they can be at these 3 levels. And we felt a consensus emerging in this regard, and talked about the possibility of a Brighton Declaration on theory of change as the new paradigm for learning in the evaluation. We also felt that especially adaptation interventions hold a promise in this regard, because adaptation interventions are different in the sense that they have, to some extent, inbuilt learning, because you are discovering what needs to be done about the specific situation that you're in. And this is true for local communities, it's true for countries as well. So there is an inbuilt learning in adaptation, and this should be reflected and also in the evaluation of adaptation. And there is also a promise then for the outside community, for, let's say, traditional development cooperation, because adaptive learning could actually lead to a further strengthening of adaptive management in development interventions, which we've long called for, but we haven't really seen how we should make this happen, as traditional logical framework approaches ask for fixed management rather than adaptive management. The last part then was to link indeed, as Lars said, what we discussed in the evaluation group to the other groups. And there, for us, a kind of aha-erlebnis, or a kind of illumination took place, that as evaluators, we should look at ourselves also as knowledge brokers. We shouldn't just outsource this to knowledge management people, to parts in our organizations that take care of communication, but we should think through, when we do an evaluation, how we as evaluators, as knowledge brokers, can help to bring the right kind of knowledge products so that they can be used for learning. So those were the 3 points that I wanted to raise.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will take now 5 minutes to discuss the link between evaluation evidence and what an evaluator can do as a knowledge broker to inform policymakers. And Andrew, you can go 2 more down. One more. Yes. So we looked at the loop between climate change evaluation evidence and climate change policy development. And what we started with was looking at why would there be a loop? And the question was that policymakers might have questions that need to be answered. And those answers might actually come from climate change evaluation evidence. Having said that, different stakeholders will have different information needs, and we started to identify what type of stakeholders are there. Private organizations, donors, CSOs, beneficiaries, but also really government and policymakers and implementing partners. And to link those two, different stakeholders, different information needs, and policymakers' questions and answers from evaluation evidence, we saw a role for lobbying. When looking at climate change policy development, there are a number of factors, and this is certainly not exhaustive, that need to be taken into account. For example, political context, agendas of people, power and the issue with respect to actual policy enforcement, accountability of towards policies, the evidence base, the social context, the supply and demand situation with respect to knowledge and information, and the budgets that are there for the development of policies. So what we then said is that there is a learning space, and to make that learning space as rewarding as possible, there needs to be ownership of this whole circle from evaluation evidence to policy development. And ownership in government, we thought, could best be gotten by institutionalizing this system. And discussing it with one another, we came to the conclusion that that was also a bit of a role of a national evaluation policy that goes over the various ministries. And another role would be to develop a learning culture within governments. Another point is that the evidence that is there will result in different messages, because different stakeholders have different information needs, and that will result in different messages. And the communication strategy that you would develop to inform policy development would first of all be informed by the type of stakeholder, by their information needs, but also by the different policy levels that are there, being the national, subnational, provincial and local level. And then we come to the feedback loop, because what if evaluation evidence is used in policy development? How can we see that the policies developed actually have any type of impact with respect to climate change interventions? And in a very nice world, how to say that, in a ideal world, you would say that participatory local evaluation of policy impact would be the outcome that you would be aiming at. For example, there would be evaluation evidence that feeds back into a NAMA, a mitigation action plan of a government, and then on the ground level you would have reforestation, deforestation actions, and you would like to see to what extent does the NAMA inform that type of intervention. And what we saw at that point, that we were perhaps a little bit too positive, because the participatory local level M&E of policies rarely happens. And the variety of different stakeholders results in a real wide variety of information needs. Moreover, you have to wonder if policymakers always ask the questions, because they don't always want to hear the answer. And next to that, there might be a mismatch in supply and demand of information and knowledge. Budgets might not be there to actually have this circle, this loop. People and beneficiaries might be forgotten in this whole system. And a question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is actually the value added for policymakers, given all the contexts in which they are operating? And I would like to leave it at that for the moment. A little bit food for thought for later on the Q&A session. And I now would like to give the word to Duncan Edwards.
Hello. I was involved in the knowledge brokers intermediary stream over the last couple of days. And I just wanted to really highlight a couple of the key themes that came out of that. And I think the first one really was the kind of role and responsibility of kind of knowledge brokering activity intermediaries. And so we kind of talked about the role of kind of infomediaries, which is essentially looking to kind of push information out. But then you go from that to kind of knowledge brokering through to information brokering as well, innovation brokering. But I think what people felt was it's really important to have a kind of self-awareness of the activities that you're engaged with, and that throughout the process that you're involved with, you might be playing a number of different roles within that. So kind of thinking about the particular agenda that you might have. Even, am I a knowledge broker? There was a number of researchers within our track who didn't realise they were actually playing that role, so it's going to be important to know that. Also thinking about the responsibilities of being a knowledge broker. What effect is your activity having within a particular context? So, how sustainable is your activity? What happens when it comes to an end? And within that, whether there are any negative consequences. Are you building up a system that relies on something that's not sustainable? And then the other major area was the context, and how context is so critical to knowledge brokering activity that really kind of having an understanding of the stakeholders involved in the process, what the kind of power dynamics might be within that, any political considerations. And within that, there was a lot of discussion on how do you broker knowledge between different contexts? How do you clearly communicate the context in which a particular, say, initiative has worked? How do you communicate the lessons from one context to another? So I think those are the main things that we were talking about over the last couple of days. So.
Okay, thank you. Charles, you will take the more national and local community view.
Yes, thanks a lot. Having participated in this particular knowledge exchange event, there's three items that really emerged, and one is the linkage. What are the differences and the similarity between communication and knowledge brokering? As an institution like African Center for Technology Studies, we do research, we inform policies, but basically the terms that we have been using is communication and sharing of the research outputs. But I didn't know that we were playing much role as knowledge brokers. So it came to my mind that we need to redefine in the African context, what's the difference, what's communication, what is knowledge brokering? Then from there, I think the researchers who are involved in linking the policymakers and the local communities in Africa can really appreciate. Secondly, the context at which we do research. We have the local communities, we are trying to do research with the local communities to inform policies, the formulation of climate change policies in Africa. And I was thinking that yesterday we have been discussing more formal ways of knowledge brokering. Then I thought of what about the indigenous, the local, the informal systems of knowledge brokering. That is very key that we need to look at. And then also the linkage between knowledge brokering and gender, and the power brokering came in. There are particular gender in the community that were very influential. How can we appreciate the local structures in the vulnerable communities in Africa? So there is a lot to be done. There is a lot that we need to share. We need to link up, and this is to inform adaptation, considering that adaptation is gradual. It's not an instant, and we need to learn a lot of lessons from the development projects.
Yes. Thank you. Lars, Otto, how do you feel these 5 views at this point capture the discussion we had over the past 2 days? Anything to add from any of the people here on this panel?
I think it captures this very well. It's the range of discussions that we had. just to add one thing that came out very clearly in our group, the first one on whose knowledge counts. Initially, we had a discussion around what usually is concluded from these type of conferences is to look at issues of power. Knowledge and power, you can't really separate the two. And we decided to turn it on its head and start looking at power and how power networks and networks of actors sort of filter the types of knowledge that enters policy process. There was a clear sense that we shouldn't be paralyzed by power. We have to work with it. We have to understand it and how it influences the types of knowledge that comes through. But yeah, so that was one thing that came out very clearly with us, and I think through discussions with other themes that came through as well, that the issue of how knowledge is used is quite essential in evaluation, in DRR, disaster risk management, but also knowledge brokers are also power brokers. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, yeah. Andrew, I wanted to open the floor to the audience right now, to the participants of this webinar, and I wanted to ask if there are any questions at this point already. And there aren't any questions at this point already. I am wondering whether that is because we captured the 2 days of this conference, of this event so well, or whether or not everyone is still pondering about the questions that they are having. So please feel free to comment, to question the things that have been said here by all 5 of us, and we are happy to engage in a discussion with you.
There's of course also a lot of dense information, so I can understand that to unwind it and to focus on one specific issue may be difficult.
Okay, we have a question from from JDev, wearing evaluation.
Where the evaluation would fit into the loop?
Fit into the loop, or how does evaluation feed into the loop?
I think it has to do with the fact that I think the question comes down to that we are talking about knowledge here, but we are not talking that much about evaluation evidence, perhaps, as knowledge. Maybe between the speakers here, that link was missing a little bit. I don't know, Rob, if you want to talk for a second how knowledge brokering relates not just to knowledge out there with respect to climate change, but also evaluation evidence from climate change interventions.
Well, I think the problem that we're facing, and that we discussed actually at this knowledge exchange here in Brighton, is that as evaluators, we tend to be focused on bringing a specific product to a specific audience. We basically think we're working for Parliament, or we're working for our council, or a governing body, or for management, and they need to have an evaluation report at the end of the evaluation. And this is what we're focused on. So all these other possibilities of entering the loop at the policy cycle, or the intervention cycle, or the programming cycle, whatever cycles you have out there, to enter these loops at different points is somewhat overlooked. We tend to go for the decision point about the next policy or about a new intervention, and to focus on that one. Whereas the experience that we are now exploring with theory-based approaches is that you can actually do more formative evaluations, where you would have intermediary products. For example, to go through an exercise with a group of stakeholders to discuss what the underlying assumptions are on why a certain intervention or is supposed to work, or what would solve the problem that the intervention tries to tackle, you may come to a learning process at that moment in time already. And you may actually have a product. We've done this now in the Global Environment Facility. We've gone through these theory-based discussions with the people involved in formulating the strategies in the GEF. And what we've seen happening is that we had a product coming out of this. The product was a kind of a revision of the strategy, or a different kind of presentation of the strategy, showing also why the strategy was supposed to work, which would then lead to further inspiration, and hopefully lots of good things happen as a result of that. But it points out to the possibility to have more intermediary products that that will also lead to learning. And this is the kind of knowledge broker role, I think, that Duncan referred to.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think that part of it comes down to the kind of flexibility within a process. That traditionally your planning process would be quite fixed. You might develop a log frame, you have certain indicators along the way, but real life doesn't work like that. You need the flexibility to change over time and respond to the evaluation and learning you're doing as an ongoing process.
Okay. I see we got two more questions. Do you want to pick one of the two?
Yeah, we have two more questions. One from Rix Bosch. Interesting that you are proposing a log frame suitable for mixed management or fixed management, but not for adaptive management. Is that not a question of formulation? Do you propose other instruments? And another one from Amy. How far ahead is the evaluation/development sector from national governments, i.e. the UK, in the way they perceive the utility of evaluations for knowledge brokering?
And I'm assuming that second question, first of all, is asking where do we stand, and secondly, it asks perhaps where do we stand compared to other countries in the world. And the first question, I have the feeling, is more towards what role do you see for adaptive management in what you were just explaining to us?
You want me to go into
the first one?
The first and the log frame issue. Well, first of all, we should recognize that log frames are also a special form of theory-based approach. I mean, in fact, the log frame is to go through what is supposed to happen in a systematic way. The problem with the log frame has always been that it's rather linear and it's rather fixed in its outcomes, in the sense of we have something that we need to work, we need to go from A to B, and we need to do these specific things, and we'll check on the way how we will get there. Whereas the later versions of theory-based approaches, as we use them in evaluation, they focus more on multiple lines of activity and underlying assumptions of what the causal relations would be between something is happening and why is this happening and what can we do actually to ensure that it really will happen. And so the log frame in itself, when we started using this, you always had these disclaimers that in principle they could also be used in a non-linear way and they could also be used in a flexible way. But the reality of it was that when it really happened, it started fixing projects. And what we said here at the conference is not so much that regular development interventions should be fixed and that adaptation should be flexible. No, we said everything should be flexible. And this is the promise that, and we can learn from adaptation in this regard. Because in adaptation, the flexibility is inbuilt. And there is no danger that, I mean, in adaptation, everybody recognizes that we are chartering uncovered territory, and we need to know how to navigate this. In regular development cooperation or interventions, what we've seen in the past is that evaluations actually told us that adaptive management is very successful. Yet our instrument of the log frame has sometimes blocked this. So we hope that actually what we learn from adaptive interventions could inform development cooperation and could inform and go for a theory of change approach in that regard. And we see this happening to some extent. The other question was whether the UK was ahead of others in this regard.
Where the UK stands.
Or where the UK stands. Well, on theory of change, in general, the UK is now moving over to theory of change. DFID is adopting this, and it sounds very promising, but at the same time, we should also recognize that DFID at the moment is really focusing on getting targets and evidence-based things happening, and so they are internally a bit in conflict, I would say. It will be very interesting to see what emerges out of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Charles.
Yeah, I think there is a point that you have clearly raised that M&E tools like log frame kind of become linear, and it's been quite challenging in Africa, especially when you engage with the communities who have been using the M&E tools like log frame, and we found out that it's quite difficult for learning to be sustained. It closes the project. You only account for the money that you have spent in the field. And I think from what you have actually expounded on theory of change, how can it build on the existing knowledge brokering in Africa? How can it strengthen the existing knowledge brokers like African Center for Technology Studies to influence the policies, to learn from the adaptive process? And we learn also the challenges that the development aspects are faced in Africa. So I think there is a lot to learn, and we need to be very aware of the risk also. How can the evaluation process enable the knowledge brokers to mitigate such a risk?
I saw two other points being brought up as well by participants, and one came from India, where the participant said, who was it who made the comment?
It's Jada.
It's Jada. He said lobbying is becoming more and more important in India to inform policy development. And then a second question, or second point, was that we need to start communicating evaluation findings to non-usual suspects. Evaluation, I think, is currently slowly but surely moving out of the area from evaluating purely for accountability towards more and more evaluating for learning. And the next step really is evaluating for those actual non-usual suspects. If you want your results of an evaluation to be used, then you need to take into account that the different suspects, the different people that could make use of these findings might be looking for different information in those findings, and that a different strategy for informing them might be needed to be used. And yeah, towards lobbying, I think evaluation findings quite often do not make it to the actual public and to community-based organizations and to human rights organizations who actually might want to run with those findings. It's very hard to take a stance there on whether or not what our role is as an evaluator, given that we, doing an evaluation, get a specific objective agenda from an organization who asks us to evaluate. Do we then have a role towards furthering, towards putting out those findings to a wider audience, or is that the role of the organization who asks us to do that evaluation? That's a very hard one on which we had long discussions as well in our groups. One of the points that was brought up as well is if you evaluate and you want to make sure that you will be evaluating in the future again, then you have to basically serve two people. That is, first of all, the person for whom, or the organization for whom you're doing the evaluation, and secondly, the people who are actually targeted by the intervention that is being evaluated. And that's a careful balance that you have to take there.
We have a couple more questions. One is from Nick Harrison. Picking up on Rob's point about the importance of engaging knowledge brokers outside of our usual network or organizations, could you elaborate on this discussion of effective processes for doing this? For example, we are currently working on a global evaluation or review of good practice in green growth planning. It will be important that we communicate our evaluation findings to non-usual suspects, e.g. finance planning ministries, rather than just climate environment ministries. Any suggestions on how best to approach this? And then there's another question from Corina von Teichmann. Do you see an increased need for independent or neutral evaluators or evaluation experts that consult throughout adaptation/development projects, or should project managers themselves be responsible?
Okay. Rob, would you like to respond to that?
Well, first of all, this issue of how we should develop ourselves as knowledge brokers is a difficult one, and it's a process that we're starting. As I said earlier, as evaluators, we've tended to outsource the problem and basically say, we'll just produce a huge report and we'll give this to the knowledge brokers, the knowledge sharers or intermediaries, and let them do their magic on this. And actually, this has been, frankly, very difficult because the knowledge intermediaries have tended to say, what is this thick report? Nobody is interested in this. Please throw it away, put it in the waste paper basket. Come back to us if you have anything that is worthwhile sharing with others. So, and then of course we said, but we need this report for our council or for our governing body, or we need to, and we should move beyond that. Yeah. But this calls for interaction with the knowledge brokers and with the knowledge intermediaries. So I think Duncan should reply on that issue. And let me get to one of the others later in the second round.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question that Rob's asking really is part of it is traditionally it seems quite a linear approach, and I think some of the discussion we've had is looking at more effective knowledge management in terms of opening up some of that process so that there's spaces for interaction by various stakeholders, whether they're the kind of usual suspects or the unusual suspects. That's a far more effective way of engaging people in a learning process. So I think part of it's about thinking about opening up the process, but then it's also looking about, from that process, what are more effective means of communicating the outputs of that. So understanding the context in which, say, someone working in a finance ministry would be working, what is the language that they're talking, what's the jargon, understanding that context is critical for them actually taking on board some of the outputs from that evaluation.
Yeah, I think what you have actually expounded on is like case in Kenya right now, whereby the climate change stakeholders are looking at who can be the gatekeeper for their adaptation funding in Kenya. And they have raised the question of maybe could it be, can Ministry of Finance, can Ministry of Environment under that, or the National Management, the National Environment Management Authority. And I think they need to be involved from the word going, capacity building on, have they been playing the role of knowledge brokers unawarely? Can they do it better? Because they'll be communicating, they'll be sharing information about the climate funding. They'll be in charge of funding. So, and the Ministry of Planning again, like for Kenya, we have a development blueprint called Vision 2030. And we are currently looking at how can we integrate climate change adaptation and mitigation into this particular document. So it will be quite proactive if they are quite involved from the word when we define with the knowledge broker, they've been playing this particular role, or they've been only communicating that they've developed this particular document so that it can become smart players. Let me use the word smart players in the climate change adaptation arena.
Just to add to what's been said, I think it's one of the important things to think about is that traditionally kind of communication of these kind of findings, it's tended to be kind of one way, and actually we need to look at what ways to make that more of an engagement and a two-way process. So it's actually communication rather than just dissemination.
Okay, the second point that I wanted to make is about the role of the evaluator in these processes. One question was whether evaluators should remain neutral outsiders and not involved in the process, or whether they should engage. And the more formative evaluation processes that we've discussed here ask for engagement. They ask for engagement without giving up objectivity or transparency in what you do. So there is a bit of a challenge to combine this, but I always maintain that an independent evaluator could actually be an even better partner for others because you're independent. So if you are partnering, you do this from the perspective that you have something to add or to contribute, and you can do this as an independent person. The second issue is that on adaptation, we've actually seen these very interesting initiatives at the local community level where evaluators played a strong role in helping local communities to understand the situation that they were in. And we have several examples from this. They're already quite old even. I mean, in 2008 at the International Conference on Evaluating Climate Change and Development, we had a stream on adaptation where several of these examples were put forward of evaluators in a very interactive way discussed adaptation issues with local communities, and together with them set up monitoring systems on, so water is essential for our crops. Where is water coming into the region? What weather patterns do we see emerging? And what do we actually need to know to be warned in advance if water is no longer as available as it used to be? Or other issues were discussed as well. So these are possibilities, and we should explore them further. We realize that we're at the beginning of this process, and that we need to continue engaging with especially the knowledge intermediaries. And actually at the end of the conference, I've challenged some of our colleagues from CDKN, telling them it's not just, it shouldn't be us as evaluators opening up more to the possibilities of producing knowledge products that can play a role, for example, in lobbying or in just informing the general public. But it's also, from your side, you should see a bit the potential that evaluations could have and help us understand what would be the right way forward.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I think Rob is right that it shouldn't necessarily be the role of the evaluator to do that, but I think that the evaluation community is giving those signals is very important. And I think echo the examples of the working with the local communities on adaptation. I think it's crucial, and it comes back to the point about adaptive management. Adaptation in its nature is something people always have done. They've done it for thousands of years, and it's about bringing their experience and knowledge into the right kind of interfaces with the policy process. And I think that's not happening at the moment to a sufficient extent. And I think there are some examples, some which you mentioned, also in terms of climate information, seasonal forecasting. There's been a lot of work on trying to bridge the gap between indigenous knowledge, community experience, and the formal scientific forecast from the outside. And I think there's a lot more work to be done there to also make sure that feeds back into the policy process. And at the moment, there are some encouraging signs, but I think more could be done there. So that this kind of experience doesn't just become a tick box, but something that's integrated throughout processes.
Okay, thank you. I saw a few questions coming by, and I want to translate two of those into more statements. One was, and that links to what Rob was saying about the role of evaluators versus the role of knowledge brokers, supply versus demand. And the statement I would then make would be evaluators need to take a demand approach instead of a supply approach. And I want to see how the panel feels about that. So they need to, basically, the statement would be they need to help generate demand from the side of knowledge brokers and policymakers instead of just supplying. Second statement, based on the question from Vinita, can evaluators be objective and at the same time assertive, fighting for the rights of the people for whom interventions are actually meant? Does objectivity and assertiveness for fighting for beneficiaries, does that exclude one another, or is that possible together? And then I've got silence. Who wants to take these two statements?
Well, first of all, on supply versus demand, you were formulating that a little bit in absolute terms. I would say that evaluators need to include demand in what they're doing, rather than to just focus on demand, because it's not really clear what that would mean. But certainly the demand for knowledge on certain issues could play a role in evaluations, and you could think of doing the evaluation with a perspective that in certain areas there are gaps in our knowledge, and we could help in bringing this knowledge to knowledge intermediaries. But I would like to make a distinction between, let's say, the many channels that we have to inform ourselves on what is happening in the world, and the big media. We should really realize that the big media tend to be interested in evaluation purely from a negative perspective. They find evaluations interesting if an evaluation proves that something did not happen or was a failure, and they look at it from the shock value and from whether this could become a scandal. This is territory that we are very uncomfortable with, because we tend to not want to go into. We want to maintain nuances and keep the findings that we have. I assume researchers have the same problem. I mean, with research also, once you're talking about the big media, so this whole issue of providing food for lobbying, or it's difficult. Once you move into the political domain, you get another kind of knowledge intermediary who is grabbing information for specific political purposes. And again, this calls for that we should be as objective and neutral and transparent as possible. Should we be assertive? Certainly, we should certainly look at what's happening on the ground. And if, the things that are happening on the ground are bad for people on the ground. Yes, we should be very assertive about this. It's part of our mandate as evaluators to look at this, and we should do it. So maybe I didn't completely catch that point.
No, I think you did catch it well. Yeah.
I was just going to really comment on that, the kind of negative aspect of kind of big media and picking up failure. And one of the things that we talked about over the last couple of days in a number of sessions was that you only really learn when you're open about failure. And how within this sector can you provide incentives for admitting failure, being open about what went wrong, why things don't work. And yeah, that's the kind of media question is quite a big part of that. So how we get from that to a new place, I don't know, but it's an important issue to consider.
Just very quickly on that, from learning from failures, I think that came up quite a lot in the workshop. And how do you create incentives in an environment where there are lots of institutional incentives not to bring up failures and not to learn from failures, because the learning is broader and for the whole organization or for the whole community, but the costs are very often individualized. So I think that we didn't come to a very clear answer to that, but I think we need to address those institutional barriers to learning also from failures. Just on the point of being assertive in terms of rights and so on, I think that comes back to the theory of change discussion, and also what is the ultimate goal of, for example, adaptation project is to support the most vulnerable and the poorest and the most marginalized in becoming less vulnerable and higher adaptive capacity. So in that sense, evaluators as well as researchers and everybody involved will be in the right to look at the evidence for what is working, what is not working in relation to that. And then you have to, whether you like it or not, you have to engage with power issues of assertiveness towards the rights and so on. I don't think you can avoid it, but as a researcher, you have to look at what is the evidence for this and study that. I think that's the best you can do.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry. My contribution is that I've had this experience in the field, and for M&E, for monitoring and evaluation team to actually create demand for the information they've gathered, I think it's quite important if the team integrates the local community, the vulnerable community, the knowledge brokers, the intermediaries in the field, so that they can develop integrated and participatory M&E tools. So that these particular communities, you can create a confidence, you can build the trust. You cannot, they can pick up the lessons from the field all the way, and then follow up maybe in terms of maybe referring students, referring to the big reports. And we had this experience in Africa, where we developed to the local communities the participatory monitoring and evaluation tools. We integrate the audio-visual, that's the videos. Though they were qualitative, we could not actually account the quantitative approaches were quite missing. But I tell you that it creates that demand, because the only people who cannot read and write, they can listen to the evaluation, the information they've gathered, the lessons learned. Yeah, rather than sometimes the big reports is not friendly to the local communities, because those are the people we are trying to learn with them to inform the national policies. So it's very important to we involve them from the initiation processes, from the start.
Two more questions, I think, came in.
There's a follow-up question about the failure. Can anyone share any examples of effective incentives for sharing failures? And we have a couple of comments, actually. So Unita is saying one should not fear putting the things which are, oh, sorry, yeah. One should not fear for putting the things which are correct in order to avoid doctor report for the client. There's a couple more comments on, let's see. Okay, on the role of evaluators, Benita's saying evaluators have to not only be independent but also assertive in fighting for the right of those whom the projects are meant for. While JDev is saying, he's saying something along the lines of there's a risk for evaluators to be not hired again in the future if they become very proactive in their reporting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Oh.
On incentives for reporting on failures, we could just have another 2 days discussing this. Because there is actually a lot to be learned from experiences in this field, and I realize that there's never been really a strong focus on this. But the issue that we found very fruitful is to, if you look at failures, you really have to be very careful on how you fit into the processes of change that are happening. If the process of change is going in a certain direction, a failure may actually encourage this further, may show that it's actually very necessary to go in that direction. So in those cases, you basically can formulate failures along lines of challenges. This is the problem that needs to be solved in upcoming work. So you suddenly approach it from a different perspective. Then if the theory of change is, or the activities that are, the change that is happening is going in the wrong direction, then the failure needs to be brought more in a negative way. This is something that is not working as it is supposed to be working. You really have to rethink your instruments and go in a different direction. And that's often also very welcome if you, the incentives are there if you manage to get evaluation recommendations attuned to ongoing debates. So if they fit into an ongoing debate. And it's really the, again, as we discussed earlier, the big media that tend to look, they tend to grab a failure and then turn this into a scandal. Which is the problem. And we should not shy away from this. Again, as we continue to be boring, neutral, transparent, objective evaluators with huge reports, the failures tend to be rather invisible for the big media. They have to go through the full report to read that and so on. The difference maybe, it's something that we should look out for when we start producing more intermediate results and interact with knowledge intermediaries to get this out there. Then we may be, we may need to have more political guidance also on what would be fruitful. So, but as I said, we could talk for hours on this. I could talk for hours on this.
And another question that I saw passing by was how does evaluation, and especially if it turns out to be evaluation that the evidence shows failure, how does that inform research?
I think that's a big question again. We could speak for hours about that. I think it requires a number of things to feed back into research. One is the way it's communicated and the way, not as a negative kind of something that's only negative and it stops there, but something that is constructive and can can lead to further research questions, and the acceptance of that from funders, I think it's very important, and especially in the area of adaptation. This is very much a learning by doing approach, and learning by successes, but also learning from failures. And in the area I've been working on local knowledge, I mean, that's basically adaptation that people have been doing for hundreds and thousands of years, is basically trying and failing and incremental improvements. Obviously, with climate change, there are new situations, new risks, and new challenges coming up. And I think then learning from where there are bottlenecks, whether it's at local level, whether it's intermediary level or national level, I think it's very key. But it's a combination of, obviously, researchers' openness to take that forward, but also the policymakers being open to change, which comes back to the adaptive management approach, and funders encouraging this as well. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that was just some brief thoughts.
Yeah, no, as you said, we can have another 2 days event purely discussing how one informs the other and what the role of failure is in that respect as well. Andrew, a last series of questions for this webinar.
Yes, in fact, comments and one question from Vinita. Evaluation can inform us about what needs to be done at global and national level on one hand. It can also inform us for regional and local level. And in policy discourses, also still from Benita, in policy discourses, one has to publish the findings and involve the media, advocacy groups, and involve communities in order to make evaluation effective. And for our last question from Dick Harrison, how do you think evaluation can effectively bridge the information gaps which prevent effective vertical integration of climate policy between national and sub-national levels, e.g. around priorities or needs?
Yes, we go from one person to the next for a last round of reflection on these two questions in the previous discussion.
Yeah, how evaluation can bridge that gap. I think these kind of dialogues is actually quite key, and I, as a researcher, I rarely have the chance to have these kind of dialogues, and I think we're at the start of a long process in addressing how evaluations can be improved, how they can better feed into research and policy on adaptation, and I think that's something that came out very clearly in the workshop as well. And we don't have all the answers, but I think just bringing these communities of practice together is very important, and you need more than 2 days to do that. I think some areas like disaster risk reduction and adaptation has done made a lot of progress over the last few years, and I look forward to further discussions about this.
I think I have two main reflections really from this session. I think really there's looking at how I was kind of talking about opening a process, but I think it's not necessarily opening up the process so everybody can see everything at each stage, but it's being open to engagement of the different stakeholders and seeing evaluation and evaluators as a stakeholder within a process. I think that's quite key to really speaking to the kind of demand for the evaluation findings, and also the kind of relevance and incorporating the kind of learning throughout the process rather than thinking as that kind of linear process. My other reflection, it's gone from my mind, I might have to come back to that.
Okay, my first reflection is that from this fora, I've learned that the evaluators, the knowledge focus, as well as the intermediary institutions and the local communities, the vulnerable communities, they need to work closely together so that they can get to understand what the secondly, again, another reflection is that there should be capacity building at all levels, from the evaluators, knowledge brokers, and the local community on what's the role of an evaluator, what's the role of a knowledge broker, what's the role of the community in this learning process of adaptation to climate change. And I think community-based adaptation approaches provide an opportunity for all these stakeholders to learn and get to mitigate the risks that we have experienced before and the potential risks that are emerging.
One of the questions related to the fact that we need to operate at different levels. As evaluators, we contribute to the community level, we contribute to national levels, to regional levels, and global levels. And climate change is, of course, by par excellence a global problem, and it's transboundary. And this poses additional problems that we also need to incorporate in all of this, because the audiences differ per level, and the way that we interact differs per level, and the kind of products that we have differs per level. Again, there is no time to explore this in detail. You could have another conference on this, but I think that in the discussions that we've had in the past 2 days about the theory-based approach, the opportunities of especially a theory of change approach to become more involved in learning and less accountability evaluators that have a pure audit style of evaluating, that we recognize these possibilities and opportunities at all levels. And so perhaps the way that we should end this is by saying that after all, there is something to be said for the Brighton Declaration of the theory of change approach to evaluation.
You came back to your... No? With that, I would like to thank the panel for their contribution. I would like to thank Andrew next to me for moderating this session, and a big thanks as well to IDS here in Sussex for hosting the event over the past days and hosting this webinar. I think it was an important event in the sense of learning from one another. It's often that evaluators come together, and it's often also that people on grassroots come together, or that climate change professionals come together, and they are very good at those moments at preaching to the choir. And in this case it was a bit different, because we had academics and ground level professionals and evaluators and academics together all in one room, which is a very good combination to get some knowledge and some ideas across from one line of thought to the next. And I think it was very informative over these 2 days. And as such a big thank you for IDS for organizing this event, and towards CDKN and the GEF Evaluation Office as well in their support. To all the participants, thank you for being here in the late afternoon, early evening in Asia, and the morning in Europe and Africa. And we will do this again at 3 o'clock UTC, and that will be aimed at the US and Europe. And the focus of that second webinar will be a little bit more on mitigation. Thank you for your time, and the